Make sure you have it on mute. We'll start any second now, Dr. Osborne. We getting the stream lined up. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Iconocast. This is with the Southeastern Louisiana University English Department Colloquium. This is Alec. I'm Tyler. And today's guest, like all of them, we're excited, but it seems like this one is going to be very relevant to a lot of things we're seeing in the social political landscape for certain. He is a scholar of rhetoric whose work explores the nuances of argument and propaganda. He just had a publication in 2019 that he was a part of called Landmark Essays on Rhetorics of Difference. What we're going to be talking about today is based on his dissertation about Black Conservative Rhetoric, and we'll be following that as far as he'll take us, and maybe a little farther into other things. But without any further ado, Assistant Professor of Rhetoric at LSU, or University, a couple miles down the street, yeah. Y'all welcome Dr. Jonathan Edward Osborne. How you doing, Dr. Osborne?
I'm doing excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me to your colloquium.
Yeah, we're glad you're here, man. And you're in Baton Rouge right now, yeah?
That's correct.
Yeah, well, we're right here in Hammond, dude. You know where we're at, huh?
Oh, yeah. I actually grew up in Louisiana, so I'm very familiar.
Yeah, well, Alex from Lake Charles. I'm from the Hammond area, and we know you're from the Shreveport area. So, yeah, we're almost, we just need somebody from Monroe, and we have it all covered. Yeah. Yeah.
There you go.
But Alec, let's get it started, dude.
Okay, so Dr. Osborne, can you explain to us what is Black Conservative Rhetoric and how has Black rhetoric developed within conservatism?
Sure. So in my research, I try to sort of look through the range of African-American rhetorics broadly and try to define different ways to understand Black rhetorics generally. So I broke it down into 3 different areas, and I found that Black conservative rhetoric tended to fit within a rhetoric of resistance that thinks about pushing against norms. Some similar rhetorics are things like the Black Panther Party or Afrocentrists, people like that, who still, identify themselves as Black or African American, and they are resisting something. But in the case of the Black Panther Party, there was more resistance of oppression, Afrocentrists, more resistance to Eurocentric norms. With Black conservatives, I see them as resisting what they would frame as victimhood narratives, essentially framing the status of being African American as being a victim of either white supremacy or some sort of subjugation. And so the way that they sort of develop this ideology is strictly from a conservative standpoint. So I would say a lot of people would probably trace this to the 1970s with William F. Buckley and that sort of conservative tradition, and you see them sort of develop out of that. So the African-American conservative tradition or Black conservative tradition does take on a lot of aspects of conservatism writ large, but they incorporate aspects of race into their rhetoric that is more identifiable with Black people.
Okay, that's interesting. How did you yourself get to, how did you become interested in Black conservative rhetoric as studying it?
Yeah, I would say it was more happenstance. I don't personally identify as a Black conservative. When I was sort of exploring my interests in graduate school, I was trying to, I think as most graduate students do, sort of find that thing that nobody's talking about. And it's like, oh, this cool, fascinating area that, obviously everybody should be interested in. And I was just, discussing this with my director, and eventually we started playing around with different identity groups. And at some point I landed on Black conservatives. I was like, well, has anybody actually looked into this? And this was sort of coming, this was around 2016. So this was around the election at the time. You had people like Herman Cain and other Black conservatives starting to become more prominent, Ben Carson as well. And it seemed pretty relevant. So I was thinking, certainly someone has written about this. So I go into the literature, I'm reading the formational texts around African-American rhetorics and not seeing anything. So then I look into articles, journals, things like that. I come across a couple of items on Black conservatism. Generally, most of the descriptions of Black conservative rhetoric is fairly negative. I imagine characterizing them as traitors, as Uncle Tom, things like that is what you would expect that. And that's certainly what you come across in the literature, the little that I did find. So I was like, well, here's this thing that nobody's talking about. I've been happily surprised at the interest of Black conservative rhetoric. I think part of that has to do with the social climate. I think there's an incredible interest in how race plays a role in politics today. I think there's been a lot of focus on the role of race, particularly in the 2020 election. There was some surprise around Trump's increase in voters who identify as African American, Latino. So there's certainly some interest in this, and I'm hoping that my research can help to illuminate how this type of rhetoric is actually persuasive to people when you might expect otherwise.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things about your study was your use of Richard Weaver's hierarchies of argument. And me and Alec loved the use of that, your explanation while you used that there's a duality in using that, we think you pulled off well. But could you explain, I guess, where you see, or can you explain to people why using Richard Weaver's framework of argument may be controversial, especially for Black conservative rhetoric,
Yes, this was certainly a issue that I came across in writing my dissertation. There were people who were not excited about it. And mostly, so there are a couple of reasons why. So first and foremost, Richard Weaver wrote a hierarchy of arguments. This is sort of his methodology for explaining conservative rhetoric. And in his hierarchy, it looks at arguments from definition should be the ones that are most persuasive, followed by arguments from blanking on the second one. But there's certain expectations on how it should go. And as you work down, it goes from most conservative to kind of conservative to more liberal. And associated with this are arguments from authority. The reason why this is so controversial is because of Weaver's personal and scholarly pursuits. He was an avid Southerner, was constantly defending the South, defending the Civil War, defending people like Robert E. Lee. For all intents and purposes, we could call him a racist. He did not see Black people as equal to white people. So here comes my dissertation, and I'm trying to figure out, how do I explain the rhetoric of Black people, Black conservatives, in a way that actually values their language, rather than me imposing something that is, postmodern or coming more from the left. So, of course, Richard Weaver is in the rhetorical tradition, the book, the rhetorical tradition. So there was some familiarity there. To me, it just made sense. Like this is something that African-American conservatives are using. And I show this in my dissertation with people like Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, Alan Keyes. You can see them using this hierarchy of arguments, maybe not explicitly, but there are obviously those connections of them speaking to authority, incorporating aspects of definition into their rhetoric. So this just made sense to me. Of course, I needed to grapple with this question of what does it mean to use a methodology by someone who is clearly racist for a racialized group that is, opposed or in opposition to Richard Weaver. And for me, there were a couple of reasons. One, it matches, it makes sense. But I think there's also value in saying that this methodology that was developed can work broadly. Like it was meant to work broadly, but Weaver saw this more narrowly in terms of race. But for applying it to Black conservative rhetoric, that means there's actually broader appeal. And I think there's another one that I didn't get to in my dissertation, but another reason for using Weaver is, his methodology is something that is already taken up within broader audiences outside of academia. Like he finds readership outside of academia. And I think scholars do a disservice to just the function of knowledge in terms of discourse, as well as participating in it by ostracizing Weaver from the record, by saying, no, his methodology doesn't count. I don't know that I have that power. Like I can't just go around saying this doesn't work because I don't believe it works. If it's taken up by other audiences, if it's being used, then it's worth our time to analyze it, understand it, and participate in that conversation to say, here might be some of the benefits and here are some of the faults. And let's work together to understand this and how it functions within broader rhetorical discourse, rather than just saying, no, like he was a bigot, he was a racist, he was sexist, his rhetoric doesn't count. I think this is a better way of using his research and scholarship.
Yeah, it was an interesting framework for certain, and it made sense. The hierarchy there, especially the argument from definition, which seems to be the basis of a lot of conservative rhetoric in general, that resolute, constant, and as you say, God-given kind of truth. So, but it was it's really cool that you acknowledge that in your dissertation, that you're going to work on that boundary and give you a little leverage with it, right? Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so on the surface evaluation of Black conservative rhetoric, we see like the two obvious identifiers, African American and conservative. Are there any other identifiers that are consistent qualities of Black conservative rhetoric that the label implies beyond its wording of race and political philosophy? And like, are the commonalities of economy, education, religion, or things like that?
Yeah, so this is something that I'm trying to work toward and sort of turning the dissertation into a monograph. So working beyond sort of the parameters of just what is Black conservative rhetoric, I'm really interested in how it applies to different spaces within the political discourse. So one way I'm doing this is sort of incorporating public sphere theory. And part of that deals with the function of media. Like what are the ways that people are communicating discursively? What are the different methods that they're taking up? And I think part of it is understanding the different spaces in which this is functioning. So one obviously is the White House or sort of spaces of power in that regard, but also economic spaces. One basically, someone who's identified as sort of the godfather of Black conservatism is an economist, Thomas Sowell, and he sort of pushed this idea of a Black conservative ideology. And much of his perspective comes from an economic perspective, rather than relying on the government to sort of support you or sustain you. There are all these opportunities in order to, as I believe many people would attribute to Booker T. Washington, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And this speaks to the historical perspective of Black conservative rhetoric, but Yeah, so the economic aspect definitely feeds into how we might identify or understand Black conservative rhetoric. There's obviously the political aspect of it, but there's also this economic dynamic that plays a role in how the rhetoric functions and how it finds value in different spaces.
Yeah, with the economics, do you find that there's an economic class of African Americans who tend to be conservative? So we saw, I mean, we see it in general that lower economic whites tend to be conservative, lower economic minorities tend to be progressive or say liberal, Democrat. Do you find that there's a pattern there with Black conservatives?
So this probably goes a bit beyond my capacities. This is more like a sociological question, but I think what I find is not necessarily the economic dynamic, but the gender dynamic that is more so Black men who are likely to be conservative. Um, of course, there are certainly Black women who identify as Black conservatives, but most of the people that I've found to study, as well as demographic information from the 2020 election, where there was a majority of Black men who were voting for Trump, voting Republican, I think that tends to be the dynamic. Because we might get to this a little bit later, but there's some interesting dynamic between a political conservatism and a social conservatism. And I haven't really fully teased that out yet, but I think that overlap tends to sort of dismiss any issues of economics, where you can have people who are lower socioeconomic and Black who identify as a political conservative, and you can have people who are higher up on the socioeconomic ladder and identify as liberal, progressive. But the gender dynamic, I think, plays a much larger role in how people fall along the political spectrum.
Yeah, I appreciate you following us down that, because it is a tightrope even there to not step too far into a sociological study, because you are principally talking about rhetoric, but there's so many things tied to it, But
Oh yeah, certainly.
what you were just talking about, even with the gender and with the move to media, you talk about how the role of literacy and literacy acquisition was very important to African American rhetoric, the way it was taken, the way that it was developed, specifically even for African American women. You were just saying about media, this evolution that we have with internet, social media. Do you find that is affecting Black conservative rhetoric specifically as well?
Yes, I think that it is increasing its capacity to engage with people. I think there was a tendency, in the 80s or 90s for Black conservatism, or at least the rhetorical means of Black conservatism, to exist much more on the fringes. And in the 80s and 90s, those fringes might pop up in the political spaces. So you had people like Alan Keyes, who was in the Reagan administration. You have Clarence Thomas, who was nominated to the Supreme Court during George H.W. Bush's term as president. So you still had occasional moments of Black conservatism sprouting up. But it wasn't very frequent, and it didn't really spark much interest early on. However, we moved now to the 2010s, 2020s, and there's just much more engagement with Black conservatism. You have people like Candace Owens, Kanye West, Omarosa. You have all of these figures who are not just working rhetorically, but they have a presence. Like their physical presence matters to people. There are much more efficient ways to become relevant. And I think that merging the sort of ethos of celebrity with the political identity that is Black conservatism is allowing it to flourish more. I haven't seen a lot of focus on this, but I think it would certainly be worth exploring how Black conservatism is functioning on a platform like Twitter, something that is, has very short language, but is very quickly disseminated amongst people. So that to me would be a really interesting study.
Yeah, well, we actually have a question from a student Kendall will ask that kind of plays in that, and you might be taking a step back and repeating some of what you said, but go ahead, Kendall.
Yeah, we have a question from Alicia asking, do your ideas of Black conservative rhetoric hold true for the next generation of Black conservatives, even those who do not hold a political office like Candace Owens, the Hodge twins, and football player Ben Watson?
Yes, I certainly do. I think part of it is, again, the just larger exposure to audiences. Like there's just an easier way to reach audiences through these types of platforms. I would definitely, if this is something that people are interested in, there's a student at Columbia University named Coleman Hughes, and he received a bit of notoriety. I think in 2019, there was a House panel that was trying to assess the validity of reparations. This got a little bit of press. Ta-Nehisi Coates was there. Danny Glover. There were a number of other people who were participating in this. Coleman Hughes was also a part of this. So you have a student, a college student who's participating in this discourse. And he essentially argued against reparations. And I think it was a very, very nuanced argument, something that I think people, I think there was a bit of consternation just because he was arguing against it. And this might be something we get into later on wanting some, or not looking at Black rhetoric as monolithic, but then when it's not monolithic, people have all kinds of eyebrows to raise. So, but you have Coleman Hughes at this moment trying to have a nuanced conversation around reparations. And I think, so, he was on C-SPAN, so there's obviously the media TV that he's able to participate in. He also has his own blog. He's a part of a new educational push by Black conservatives called 1776 Unites. It's a really fascinating website where they are creating curriculum that essentially argues against the 1619 Project. So there are all these different ways that Black conservatives are forming their rhetorical skills and moving them in different spaces, online spaces, and gaining traction. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for Black conservatives, and they're taking those advantages. They're taking those opportunities.
Dope.
Yeah, so moving away from this contemporary sort of where Black conservatives now, what about the South and its like conservative nature? How has the South played in the African American rhetoric? Like, so how have Black conservatives in the South come to be in the rhetoric? I'm saying,
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I say that mostly because the most of the people that I've studied actually are not from the South. You have people like Colin Powell, who grew up in New York. You have people like Condoleezza Rice, who spent a lot of time in California. I mean, she's from Mississippi, if I remember correctly. I think there's a desire to sort of separate the history of the South from the sort of current expression or iteration of the South. And that makes sense. I don't think many people want to associate themselves with the Civil War or slavery or any of those things. They're anathema to most people's identity of self. But I think there's some there's still a desire to see the South as different from the North, and I think that can play a role in understanding Black conservatism, Black conservative rhetoric, to say that, so let's look at a specific example of Tim Scott, who's a senator from South Carolina. And he spoke at the 2020 Republican National Convention, and I think it's something fascinating. I'm actually working on an article right now that's looking to analyze it. And it's very interesting to see how he references the South without actually naming the South. So he talks about how his grandfather wasn't able to go to school because he had to work in the fields. Never names indentured servitude, never says that this was because he was Black. It was more, he wasn't able to get the education that he wanted. So there's that sort of framing within traditional conservative values, but there's this tinge of race that is there but never articulated. And I think this is something that you find more often, of referencing things that we associate with the South, but not necessarily naming it. And so therefore they can appeal to their own constituents. So Republicans can say, oh, well, that's a denial of education. Like we're not for that. We want more educational choice. And then you can potentially appeal to people on the left who can identify those racial disparities and say, oh, that's also negative. Like I want people to be able to do things without regarding their racial, without regarding race as something of a detriment. We should see that as something that is a benefit. And so there's this interesting tightrope that I think a lot of Black conservatives in the South are trying to make. And I think Tim Scott is sort of emblematic of that.
You talk about how politicians, in the beginning of your dissertation, you talk about Obama uses this Black conservative rhetoric with this religious aspect because it's beneficial to see that there's like a religious affiliation with Black people. So what are the religious roots of this conservative thought?
So I would say that Blackness within the church is more or less foundational to African-American rhetorics writ large. We see this with a lot of the language messaging that grew out of the church, things like testifying or the sort of religious intonations that come out of the church. And you also see this with a lot of leaders. So you see this with Martin Luther King Jr., you see this with even recently Warnock out of Georgia. You see this constantly happening where African Americans see the church as the quintessential ethos, that if you can reference your religiosity, then that means that you can also speak to Blackness in a way that is, and I use this term tepidly, but in a way that's real. And I think that is something Black conservatives also tap into. More so on the political side. So you won't really see this a lot in economic spaces. I don't think you won't find this a lot in academic spaces, even though you have a number of Black conservative academics out there. But when you get into the political spectrum, I think there's just an expectation that as a Black person, you're going to tap into this Black religious heritage. And I think this goes even back to Frederick Douglass. He would also have references to religion in his text. So this is something that is just universally expected as a Black person working in political spaces, that you're going to have a religious component to your rhetoric.
Yeah, that ties very nicely to the Richard Weaver hierarchy there. That
Yeah, exactly.
religious nature is that argument from definition. So, and that's
Mhm.
interesting in that dissertation you pointed out, because the Nation of Islam, Black atheists, how those are considered, you could categorize those as resistance within resistance, just as Black conservatives. And that might be, I mean, for those two, Black atheists and Nation of Islam, that's because of religion, because of the
Mhm.
argument of definition, who they claim their ethos from. It's a different
Right,
religion
right,
from
exactly.
definition.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's just pervasive.
Yeah. And that's interesting. That, can you explain for us, because we hear a lot about testimony in our department, especially in this era of literary study that we do with trauma. But can you tell us this difference between testimony and testifying,
Mhm.
where that testifying concept comes from, and what are the differences, and which one applies to Black conservative rhetoric in a stronger way to you?
Yeah, yeah. Like I was saying, like these both testimony and testifying speak to authority, your ability to speak for Black identity, express Blackness in a way that is real. Again, I use that term tepidly. So testifying comes from a Black church or religious tradition that sees a relationship between the preacher and the congregation. There's this sort of back and forth that occurs with the congregation. This is slightly different from call and response. The call and response is more the conversation. Testifying is more being called upon to establish your credibility within the church. Testimony is also calling upon to establish your credibility. The difference that I see is one, contextual. So testifying tends to stay in the church. It's not really a genre that you would expect to see outside of the church. And it's also very familial. I feel like testimony is something that is much broader. It has connections to politics, but also to law. And I think it speaks to a type of authority that we would more associate with positions of power, as opposed to sort of a familial conception. So to me, there's this distinction between, I guess, power and community. And I think that would be the dividing line for me, because they both are serving similar functions, but the context is different. The audience can be different. The outcome tends to be very different.
Yeah, that ritualistic testifying within the group that already knows. And testimony is, I think in your dissertation, you say it is, it's like an act of trying to receive empathy from someone who,
Mhm.
is that correct? It's like an empathetic
Yeah.
kind of rhetoric. So cool. We actually have a question that just popped up for that, Kendall.
Yeah, we have a question from Holden asking, on the rhetorical combination of ethos and testimony, do you see any other types of people using that sort of combination?
Yes. I would say, I don't know, there's so many examples that I tend to think of. And it's one of those things that I don't think we pay enough attention to, but it's something that happens around us all the time. You can look at the Women's March and see how women are giving their own testimony about being traumatized by the Trump administration, by his election, by a lot of the language that he used, and they're essentially arguing for empathy. Like, why don't you identify with this pain that I'm feeling, that other women are feeling? We see that. We can also look at a lot of the shootings of Black people and the press conferences that follow those. So you have family members who stand up and talk to the state, whether that's the mayor, governor, president, what have you, and they're trying to sort of say, like, look at the pain that this is causing our family, our community, Black people across the country. Like, this is something that needs to be addressed. So again, we're seeing this sort of connection to empathy and to testimony. And I just think it's something that we constantly, like, it's constantly there. But we're not really identifying it because, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think to name it as testimony is to, in some ways, distance ourselves from the humanity of the moment. We, like, in a way, this is sort of intellectualizing a very emotional moment. And there's, I think, a lot of value in taking time to appreciate the emotions of the moment, the pathos. But also we can step back and say, oh, this is also someone trying to establish their ethos through testimony. They're trying to connect with the audience, and they're trying to connect specifically in these examples with people in positions of power to create change. And so I think this is something we see a lot. And I think also, again, speaks, credibly to how Weaver developed his hierarchy. Like, it works. And to the examples that I put in the dissertation of Obama, this is like Black conservative rhetoric itself is a tool. It's not necessarily something that is solely applicable to people who identify as Black conservatives.
Yeah.
In your dissertation, you're like talking about the interest in studying Black conservative rhetoric, and you say that they're ostracized, Black conservative rhetoric is ostracized by the Black community and then tokenized by conservatives. So what does that mean, and where do we see that?
Yes. So I see them as ostracized and tokenized mostly within the Black community. So we can touch upon a little bit how this works in political spaces, but within Black communities, Black conservatives are just not, they're not welcome for any number of reasons. Again, they're seen as Uncle Toms, they're seen as race traders, they're seen as people who are putting their own self-interest above those of the community. And so they're ostracized. They are not, their views are not appreciated within Black communities. There tends to be a lot of difficulty in finding common ground between Black conservatives who might advocate for school choice and Black people who see their children being set upon within the school district and say, well, this isn't working. Like, the school choice doesn't work because of X, Y, and Z reasons. We need to do this. So there's a tendency to ostracize their perspectives. The tokenization happens within the Black community where they'll maybe say, like, okay, Condoleezza Rice is a good one, or Colin Powell is a good one, or something like that. But there's also a lot of tokenization within the conservative political spaces where you'll have like one or two Black speakers at something like CPAC or the RNC. I would say this past RNC was actually an exception, where you had like just a cavalcade of Black conservatives coming out to speak, which, I think is good. I think that's potentially a view of something becoming more diverse. I think it's become problematic for a number of reasons, not least of which all of their speeches were essentially targeted toward Black people and not saying this is something that is more broadly applicable. But you see this sort of tokenizing of, well, we have the Black person to speak to Black people, so we're good. So this is where I see the ostracization and tokenization occurring for Black conservatives, which leaves the valuation of their rhetoric lacking. Hence the lack of scholarship, and hopefully we'll be able to produce something to help to start fill that void.
What about, is there tokenization of Black rhetoric on the other side of this political spectrum? Like, is there this?
I don't think so. I don't. I don't see, particularly now. Like maybe, I would say if we were in the 90s, then yes, like there could be some tokenization on the left. But like there's no way for like a Ben Carson to get invited to any national convention for Republic or for Democrats, let alone having a conversation between someone like Alan Keyes and Cornel West. Like that's never going to happen. So that there's just too much resistance to Black conservatism within Black spaces typically, but also just democratic or progressive spaces for there to be, tokenization, let alone acceptance.
Yeah. So to clarify, so there's no Black conservative rhetoric that is tokenized on the left, but what about just Black rhetoric? Do you feel like that might be tokenized on the left?
Rhetoric of resistance.
Yeah, the rhetoric of resistance.
Oh. I don't think so. I think there's an active desire on the left to elevate Black rhetorics, and I think we can look at examples such as Black Lives Matter. We can look at examples like hashtag Say Your Name. We can see a lot of these examples where rhetorics that are developed by Black people, ones that focus on issues of oppression, issues of subjugation, they are finding a lot more footing within the left, particularly in today's age. So I feel like there's much more acceptance of Black rhetorics today than there probably has ever been.
Gotcha. With that, so why do you think that Black peoples, African American people, have been politically categorized uniformity? So follow this for us, because we do have a little setup for you that we want to see what you have to say. But why do you think that as a group it's been viewed as uniform, so that we have these kind of resistance within resistances framework you have? Why do you think it's perceived that way?
Yeah, I would say there are two reasons. So the first reason is just a power dynamic, where it's just very easy for people in power to view another group and say, well, because they are smaller, because they have less power, we can reduce them to like whatever major issues are appearing. And working forward from something like the Civil War and the emancipation of enslaved people, I think it's very easy to see that there are certain issues that are going to take precedence over ones that might seem more trivial. So issues of food, shelter, health are going to take precedence over issues that might look at, I don't know, like where you're living, or issues that are just not as predominant. So I think that's part of it, the power dynamic of having just one looking at a group of people and saying, well, there are only these certain issues that are at play, and it's much more important to get behind those issues. So I think an excellent example of this is the civil rights movement in the 1960s, where there were very clear issues around voting that people like Dr. King were pushing. Was this the only issue? Absolutely not. And I think this is partly why he's remembered the way that he's remembered. If we think about the March on Washington, everybody remembers the second half of his speech, where he talks about where the I have a dream part. But very few people talk about the first part of his speech, where he's talking about issues of economics, where he's essentially referencing what became the Poor People's Campaign. So there's this sort of separation that occurs, and it's just much easier to create an expectation that these few issues come to dominate the rhetorics that are at play, and also how we understand them from a power dynamic. I think the other part is the push by Black people to sort of form a foundation for their rhetorical perspectives. I think there's certainly been a lot of diversity, and a lot of the work of scholars today is working to unearth that. So people like Jacqueline Jones Royster, Eric Darnell Pritchard, a lot of fantastic scholars are trying to show a lot of the diversity that has existed, but there's always this need to sort of focus the rhetorical perspective, saying like, this is the thing that we need to focus on. I think you hear Obama talk about this all the time, where there's like, yes, there are all these other issues, but we need to do this one thing. And if we can do that, then we'll be able to address something later on. So those are sort of the reasons why I think there's a perspective of Black rhetorics generally being monolithic, that there's one coming from a position of power saying that, well, these are the only things that should be of an issue, and then coming from the perspective of Black people saying like, well, we need to accomplish this in order to do something else down the road.
Yeah, and we're seeing that sort of monolithic idea like being played out. Like we see in this last election, Biden has talked about like this monolith that you're speaking of when he says that if you're like, you ain't Black if you're voting for Trump instead of me. Like, I mean, that's paraphrased, but so like, what are the, like we're seeing like how that's being impacted, and like, do you see how this, like looking at Black people monolithic in their voting, do you see its like implications?
Well, I would like to say that it's a detriment, but it isn't. Black people historically vote as a bloc. I don't know, like it's difficult, because I would like to say from a political standpoint that a diversity of voices would lead to more progress, more diversity of outcomes. I think that would be a very conservative position to take, and yet that's not really what we see, or at least that's not what's playing out. Where you can look at Georgia, where Black people more or less voted in a block. I think in the 2020 election for the president, I think it was around 90% of Black people voted for Biden. I don't know, like I think particularly from a political perspective, there's just too many Black people who still see their political identity and their racial identity intertwined. And there's not really a way to separate that. I think the rhetoric from Republicans doesn't help. They're still a lot of their rhetoric seems to be tinged with aspects of racism. And so that makes it harder for a lot of Black people to vote Republican. Yeah, I know like Biden, like he knows he messed up. That was, you know, a very ridiculous thing to say. But I think there's a lot of truth in what he was saying, that Black people see their political identity and their racial identity as the same. And while we should never assume someone is Black because they voted Democratic, we would not be remiss in thinking it.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, we have another student question here. Who do we have, Kendall?
All right, we have a question from Gabe asking, with an ethos based on an objective truth, would Martin Luther King Jr. be classified as using Black conservative rhetoric?
So yes, he would. He's working to establish credibility with his audience. I think there are a couple of things we would have to, you know, disentangle. So part of it is, you know, you can use aspects of Black conservative rhetoric with things that are seen as more progressive. Obama does this all the time. I think this is something that allows you to have broader appeal. By framing his ethos as something that was tied to, one, Christianity, but also ideas of truth, Dr. King was essentially working to establish credibility with as many people as possible. You know, we can't really forget the context in which he was speaking, where white people just collectively had a lot of issues with taking direction from someone who was Black. So it just made a lot of sense for King to try and appeal to them in as many ways as possible. And one of those ways I would identify as adapting aspects of Black conservative rhetoric. So yeah, I would definitely characterize that as falling within this tradition.
Since you just bring that up, how else would you classify the authorities or the ethos of Black conservative rhetoricians? Is it simply it can't it's not just God? Or there what are their other what's the resume of credibility for them? You know? Yeah.
I mean, obviously God's at the top. You want God's vote of confidence. But another is appealing to something like the founding fathers. So if you can say, well, you know, obviously George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, like this is the tradition that I'm following in. That's another way of establishing credibility. Referencing law is another way. If you can speak to how your perspective is in line with the Constitution, is in line with certain judgments or laws that are in place, then that's another way of establishing credibility. Essentially, what conservatives writ large try to do, and Black conservatives are look to what is the sort of oldest tradition that we associate with our culture. And that is a way of appealing to ethos. So again, like Christianity, God, but also the founding fathers and the Constitution, laws, like these are the ways that Black conservatives and conservatives establish credibility or ethos with their audiences.
Yeah.
So how would you say Black conservatives identify their socioeconomic disparity that is observable, classified by ethnicity and sex and gender and religion with their testimony, with their ethos?
So I think this is an excellent point, that Black conservatives are not blind, right? Like they see a lot of these issues. They don't sort of separate themselves from the issues that affect Black people, but they just have a different way of approaching it. They see they see issues like poverty, issues of unemployment. And essentially what they do is they say, look at me, I made it, so you can make it. They reference their own success. So that's their narrative or their testimony, and the way that they express their economic position. You have people like Jason Riley, who is on the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, who's published multiple books on this topic. Thomas Sowell again, Walter Williams, Glenn Lowry, all of these individuals will sort of look at the state of the issues and say, well, yes, Black people are struggling, but it's mostly because they're not taking advantage of the multitude of opportunities that are available to them. And I know this because I took advantage of them. I was able to go to college. I was able to start my own business. I was able to work with all these people and find success. And the operative thing there is this is a very humanistic perspective, right? This is, again, looking at this from the modern versus postmodern perspective. Like a postmodern reading of Black conservative, I just don't think would work, because that the I it tends to be missing from the postmodern. Whereas the humanistic, well, that's all about the I. And so this is where conservatism, Black conservatives are sort of establishing their ethos and saying, well, if I can do it, so can you.
Yeah, as a millennial and some of these Gen Zers, we'll joke about how my generation here lately, it seems like they have that kind of pick yourself up, that kind of entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah.
But so I can get how that might be applicable to certain people for certain. I don't feel that way. I guess maybe I do, maybe I don't. One thing that me and Alec here, we're trying to figure out what you mean, and we get what you mean, but we've been conditioned to fight this thought like this. When you conceptualize Black conservative rhetoric as saying like white ideas in a Black way, what do you mean by that? Like, we get to ethos and testimony, but with those saying it like that, is there something else you're pulling in by saying that, you think? Is it just saying it cooler? That's what we thought. Like, yeah, like put a little rhythm on it is what is going on.
I'm always trying to, up my own ethos. But no, I think there's a lot of value in naming things, right? Like,
right.
If we don't beat around the bush and just say that clearly this is something that works for white people, and here are some Black people who are just trying to do the same thing. So that's what it is.
Yeah, it was like one of the first. It might even been in the abstract or the introduction or whatever. And me and Alec were like, wait, where are we going with this? Because that's a true statement. You're right. And even the way that the framework in which you're presenting that, it makes total sense. But yeah, with the ethos, with the testimony, do you see any other marginalized groups using that combination? Is this exclusively to Black conservative rhetoric? Do you see it in other ethnic groups, religious groups in America? Do you see that?
Yeah, so this is something that is historical in nature. It's not really talked about much, but there were Black people who didn't want slavery to end. There were Black people who didn't want, or who fought for the Confederacy voluntarily. There are Black people who want more guns. Honestly, we probably wouldn't have the Second Amendment the way it is, except for Black people. So we have all of these different moments where Black people are sort of working and establishing themselves in different ways that we might not expect. Outside of sort of Black communities, I think we see this in a number of different spaces. So again, there's I think a gendered dynamic to this as well, not just women, but queer people, where there's this sort of desire to establish ethos through testimony, but also through referencing other ideas that are sort of foundational or form a type of establishment from which they can then build their other arguments. But I think I would certainly point toward Latin American people within America. There are a lot of movements around labor, and I think they tend to be at the forefront of a lot of those conversations. And again, they can speak to this usually as former day laborers or people who are within that community and can work to establish ethos with both people there, but also political actors in order to affect change. I think there's also a move to incorporate this in terms of different voices on the political spectrum. I don't think there's enough talk of the conservatism within Latin American discourse. You have people like Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, just the entire Cuban population of Miami and South Florida, who identify as conservative. And we sort of just like, okay, that's cool, and move on, rather than asking, well, where is this coming from? And how does this play into the larger political landscape of the country? So I think there are just a lot of interesting spaces in which this is occurring, just not a lot of people talking about it.
Yeah, cool.
Well, that's interesting. Now, me and Tyler both read your dissertation, so we're interested if you have anything else you're working on. Yes.
So as I mentioned, I'm working on turning part of the dissertation into a book, and incorporating public sphere theory to think about this, not just in terms of the means of rhetoric, but also the spaces in which this is occurring. This is, as I'm sure you can imagine, a long-term project, so it's in the works, but I can't speak too much to it right now. But I do have a couple of other things. So I'm working on an article about the 2020 election, where I talk about people like Tim Scott and Daniel Cameron, who's the Attorney General in Kentucky. And I'm also interested in rhetoric and law. So I'm working with a colleague in Texas on the role of rhetoric in parole board hearings. And I don't know, it'll be interesting, because I don't think there's enough conversation around how things that we assume are more logical are actually not. We think of law as being logical, but there's a lot of persuasion that is occurring. And I think we need to talk more about that. And that's one of the areas that I hope to keep doing that. One of the areas I hope to keep exploring.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it, because for us, this was very interesting, and in a way that we had thought that there probably would have been when we were researching your thoughts. We found that you were filling a space that had not been filled. We would have thought it would have been filled at this point, especially with how much attention Black conservative rhetoricians get, it seems like. And it's very much alive. That's what's so hard. Like earlier in the conversation, we were trying to figure out, how are we going to talk about rhetoric without tapping into all of these other things that define it and create it and interact with it. But that's just the game, right?
Yeah, I think that's what makes it so fascinating. Like you can't, like, it's not just the rhetoric. You always have to think about the social aspects, the economic aspects, the political aspects. Like it's just all there. And that's what excites me, because I can, scratch all these different interests at the same time while focusing on something I love.
Yeah, well, that was it for us, Dr. Osborne. We really appreciate you being here. Really, it's exciting to know that you're right there in Baton Rouge. one of us wants to get a PhD, we might have to head down there, right, Paige? Yeah.
Yeah, come on down.
Yeah. Well, that's it for us today, guys. The Iconocast. My man Alec here. I'm Tyler. Shout out to this production crew. We had Kendall, Caleb, and Paige. Thank you again, Dr. Osborne. Next Friday, we will have Dr. Barbara Forrest. She was a philosophy teacher here at Southeastern, and she was the principal witness in the trial Kilsmeyer versus the County of Dover against intelligent design in schools. And it's a fascinating conversation. She has since retired, but make sure to tune in and check out Dr. Osborne. We'll be looking for that article, hopefully by the end of the year. And we know them books take a while, we do. So we'll be keeping eyes on you too. And thank you guys for joining us on the Iconocast Southeastern Louisiana University English Department Colloquium. We'll see y'all next Friday. This will be archived. So if you just call us at the end, jump on iconocast.org and you can see everything that Dr. Osborne had to say. We'll see y'all next week.